Julián Herrera, known to his students as El Maestro Mexicano, was a pillar of righteousness amidst the chaos of Ciudad Juárez in the 2000s. His life was that of an ordinary man who found in education a weapon against the ignorance and violence eroding his city. As a high school history teacher, he didn't just teach dates and events. He inspired his students to see the world with a critical eye, to question the structures of power, and to believe in the possibility of a different future. This story is a descent into a hell that is all too real for so many. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you feel that fire in your gut against injustice, then I'm personally begging for your help. We are fighting to build a community here, a place for voices that are otherwise ignored. Please smash that subscribe button. We are desperately trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you is a warrior in that fight. Let me know you're with us. Comment what city or country you're watching from, so I know I'm not shouting into the void. His classroom was a sanctuary, a refuge from the brutality of the streets. The walls were covered with maps of ancient empires, quotes from philosophers, and photos of revolutions that changed the course of humanity. For Julián, every class was a battle against apathy. He gestured with fervor, his eyes shining as he described the fall of tyrants and the rise of ideals of freedom. His students, young people whose lives were marked by poverty and the constant threat of the cartels, listened to him with a rare attention. They saw in El Maestro not just a teacher, but an example of dignity. He treated them like intellectuals, challenging them to debate, to write, to dream. Julián represented the promise that, through the mind, they could escape the clutches of the fate that the city seemed to have laid out for them. He was living proof that decency still existed, even when everything around them suggested otherwise. However, the serenity of his calling masked an abyss of suffering. 2 years prior, Julián's life had been shattered. His wife, Sophia, a musician with a gentle soul, and his 7-year-old daughter, Luna, who had the same curious eyes as her father, were kidnapped in broad daylight. The crime, marked by the characteristic cruelty of a local gang, ended in the worst way imaginable. Their bodies were found days later, abandoned in the desert that swallowed the city's secrets. The investigation that followed was a bureaucratic farce, a theater of incompetence and fear. The police officers, with their empty gazes and rehearsed excuses, were just another cog in the corrupt machine that allowed monsters like El Carnicero, the sadistic gang leader, to act with total impunity, turning Julián's pain into a silent, unanswered echo. Since then, Julián's home, once filled with the melodies of Sophia's violin and Luna's laughter, had become a silent tomb. Every object was a relic of a lost happiness. His daughter's sketchbook on the coffee table, his wife's favorite dress still hanging in the closet, her scent that he insisted he could still smell on her pillows. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, the pain of physical presence, a constant weight on his shoulders. The nights were the worst, when the silence was broken only by distant sirens and the sound of his own breathing. He spent hours awake, reliving memories, analyzing every detail of the day he lost them, torturing himself with questions that would never have answers. The grief consumed him, transforming the passionate teacher into an empty shell, a man haunted by a past he could not change. During the day, he wore the mask of the dedicated educator, channeling his anguish into his passion for teaching. The classroom was the only place he could forget, even for brief moments, the void that was devouring him. The structure of the routine, the smell of chalk and old books, the sound of young voices debating complex ideas, all served as a fragile barrier against the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. However, his most observant students, like the young and perceptive Elena, noticed the melancholy in his eyes, the sadness hidden behind his inspiring speeches about justice and revolution. They didn't know the depth of his loss, but they felt the weight of her absence. Julián taught about the historical struggle between civilization and barbarism, not knowing that this very struggle was about to become the center of his own existence. The contrast between his two lives was stark and was fragmenting him from within. The teacher who preached reason and dialogue was, in his solitude, a man who fantasized about the most primitive form of justice. He collected newspaper clippings about the rising tide of violence, studied the movements of the gangs, and mapped out in his mind the territories controlled by the criminals. The discipline he once used to prepare his lessons was now secretly applied to a new, dark curriculum. He read about urban guerrilla tactics, survival techniques, and the psychology of predators. The methodical educator was slowly forging within himself the tools of a hunter. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but inside Julián, a new and terrible conviction began to take shape, fueled by grief and helplessness. Julián's facade of normality crumbled on a grey Tuesday afternoon. He was summoned to the police station, a place he had learned to hate, with its peeling walls and the smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with despair. Detective Morales, a man with slumped shoulders and a tired gaze, received him with the same rehearsed expression of pity as always. With bureaucratic coldness, Morales informed him that the murder case of his wife and daughter was being officially closed. "Lack of evidence," he said, the words sounding like an obscenity. "Pressure from above, limited resources. You understand." Every word was a stab, the final confirmation that the system he tried to make his students believe in was a lie, a cruel joke told at the expense of the innocent. In that moment, something inside Julián definitively broke. The pain, which until then had been an open wound, solidified into a cold, cutting rage. He said nothing. He just looked into the detective's eyes, a gaze so empty and intense that it made Morales look away. Julián stood up, formally thanked the officer, and walked out of the station, leaving behind the last spark of hope he still held for the justice of men. The sky over Juárez was heavy, foretelling a storm. As the first drops of rain began to fall, staining the dust on the streets, Julián walked aimlessly. But for the first time in 2 years, a clear and terrible purpose began to form in his mind. The lecture was over. The class on the failure of the system was complete, and he, El Maestro, would be responsible for the final exam. Upon arriving home, the news of the case's closure weighed on Julián like a shroud. The rain outside was now a downpour, mirroring the storm brewing inside him. He stood in the middle of the living room, the sound of the rain on the roof, the only noise breaking the oppressive silence. His eyes slowly scanned every photograph, every object that kept the memory of Sofia and Luna alive. For 2 years, he had preserved that place as a museum of his pain, a shrine to a past that would never return. But the system's decision, the cowardly acceptance of impunity, had desecrated that sacred space. Justice would not come from the outside. If it were to exist at all, it would have to be forged by his own hands. In that instant, grief gave way to a terrifying clarity. The teacher who believed in the gradual reform of society died, and in his place, something more ancient and implacable began to awaken, a primal force demanding balance through blood. With a methodical calm that contrasted with the turmoil of his emotions, Julián began to dismantle the shrine. He was not erasing his memories, but transforming them into fuel. Carefully, he packed the photographs of his family into a small wooden box. Luna's last drawing, a smiling sun with childish lines, was folded and placed in his wallet next to his heart. He took Sofia's dress from the closet, smelling her scent one last time before putting it away. Each gesture was a ritual, a farewell to the man he had been. It was not an act of forgetting, but of armament. His pain would no longer be an anchor holding him to the past, but a compass that would guide him in the darkness. From that moment on, his house would no longer be a place of mourning, but the headquarters of a solitary war, a war he would wage in their name. In his office, Surrounded by history books that narrated the fall of empires and the fury of the oppressed, Julián opened a new notebook. In it, there were no lesson plans or notes on the French Revolution, but a meticulous organizational chart of the gang that had destroyed his life. For months, he had used his academic discipline to investigate. He watched, listened, and connected the dots that the police had conveniently ignored. He knew the names, the faces, the places they frequented. The first on the list was a man named El Chacal, a low-level enforcer known for his brutality and for bragging about his crimes in the fetid bars of the outskirts. He was a small piece, but the board had to be dismantled piece by piece. Julián planned his approach with the precision of a historian analyzing a military campaign, every step calculated, every variable considered. The lesson on cause and effect was about to begin. The decision to act was the moment when resignation turned into purpose. He would no longer be a passive victim of his city's moral bankruptcy. If the law did not serve the just, he would become his own law. This choice, born from the deepest despair, was the trigger that set him on a path of no return. It was the silent promise made to the graves of his wife and daughter, an oath that their deaths would not be just another forgotten statistic. If you have ever felt helpless in the face of injustice and understand the strength that is born from that feeling, know that it is this energy that moves me to continue telling these stories. The subscription of each one of you to the channel gives me the strength not to give up, to ensure that these voices, even if fictional, echo and are not silenced. Night fell on Juarez, bringing with it the darkness that now seemed to be Julián's natural habitat. He put on dark, functional clothes, a far cry from the starched suits of a teacher. On his face, there was not the warm expression of the educator, but a cold mask of determination. He took a piece of white chalk from the blackboard in his office, a familiar object now repurposed as a tool of his new trade. He did not carry a firearm. His first weapon would be the element of surprise, his intellect, and the contained fury that drove him. As he slipped out the back door, plunging into the dimly lit and dangerous alleys of his city, Julián Herrera, el Maestro, left his old identity behind. That night, he would become something new, a dark symbol of retribution. He was the Chalk Avenger. The hunt for El Chacal led Julián to a damp, foul-smelling alley behind a noisy cantina where the stench of cheap beer and urine hung in the air. The violence, when it happened, was neither clean nor cinematic. It was clumsy, desperate, and brutal. Julián ambushed the criminal, using his body weight and the element of surprise. The fight was short and savage, a clash of brute force driven by the desperation of one and the accumulated fury of the other. Julián, propelled by the image of his daughter, acted with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. There was no dialogue, only the sound of breaking bones and the gasping breath of two men on the threshold of death. He subdued El Chacal, and the final act was quick, almost anticlimactic, an abrupt silencing of the life of a man who had caused so much pain. The adrenaline sustained him to the end, but the price was immediate and devastating. As soon as El Chacal's body fell limp on the dirty ground, reality hit Julián like a punch to the gut. The stench of blood mingled with the alley's garbage, and he doubled over, vomiting violently. The trembling in his hands was uncontrollable. The image of the man's face, twisted into a mask of shock and pain, burned into his retina. This was not an abstract concept of justice discussed in a classroom. It was the visceral annihilation of a life. The teacher within him recoiled in horror at what the executioner had done. He felt filthy, contaminated by an act that, though directed at a monster, brought him dangerously close to the same darkness. With a trembling hand, he took the piece of chalk and wrote on the brick wall above the body, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." The Nietzsche quote was a lesson for himself. The following nights were a torture of insomnia and nightmares. Julián relived the confrontation, the touch of skin, the final sound. Yet, the guilt was overshadowed by a new frightening sensation, a sense of fulfilled purpose. The city awoke to the news of a peculiar murder, and the Chalk citation intrigued the media and the police. Julián realized that each elimination could be more than an act of revenge. It could be a statement, a macabre lesson for the city. He became more methodical, honing his techniques. His second hunt targeted 2 other gang members, cornered in an abandoned warehouse. This time he was faster, more precise, his hesitation replaced by a cold efficiency. He subdued them, and next to their bodies left a physics equation calculating the force of a fatal impact. Vengeance was becoming a science. The press, hungry for a narrative amidst the chaos of daily violence, dubbed the mysterious killer El Justiciero de Guise, the Chalk Avenger. The figure became an urban legend, a ghost who punished the untouchables. Some citizens celebrated him as a necessary hero, a symptom of the state's failure. Others feared him as just another monster on the loose. Julián, the man behind the myth, heard the whispers and read the headlines with a surreal detachment. By day, he continued to be El Maestro, discussing ethics and civic responsibility with his students, while at night he embodied the breaking of all those principles. This duality was emptying him, but the list of names in his notebook was not yet finished. Each crossed-out name was another step into the darkness, but also a step closer to the man at the top, El Carnicero. With each new mission, his efficiency increased. He learned to move unseen, to use the urban environment to his advantage, turning the shadows of Juarez into his allies. The third elimination took place in a junkyard, a labyrinth of twisted metal and rust. The target was the gang's logistics man. Julián used his intelligence to set a trap, manipulating the environment to isolate his target. The violence was again swift and decisive. This time, the chalk message was a simple historical date, the beginning of the reign of terror in the French Revolution. He didn't feel the same nausea as the first time, and this lack of revulsion scared him more than the violence itself. He was adapting, normalizing the act of killing, and the loss of his humanity was becoming the collateral cost of his crusade for justice. His solitary journey isolated him completely. He distanced himself from colleagues and the few friends he had left, fearing his darkness might infect or expose them. The only human connection that still felt real was with his students, but even that was tainted by his hypocrisy. How could he teach them about building a just society when he himself operated outside of any law? He saw himself in the eyes of Eleanor, his brightest former student, and felt a pang of shame. She represented the hope and integrity he had abandoned. He was a history teacher who was becoming one of its darkest characters, a man who, in his quest for justice, adopted the tools of tyranny, believing his noble ends justified his brutal means. The paradox was his prison. Meanwhile, the murders of the Chalk Avenger landed on the desk of Detective Morales. An honest cop in a corrupt system, Morales was tired and disillusioned, but he wasn't stupid. He saw a pattern that others ignored. The victims were not random. They all belonged to the same gang, the same one he knew was responsible for the closed case of a teacher and her daughter 2 years ago. The methodology, the precision, and above all, the messages left in chalk, did not fit the profile of common cartel violence. This was personal, intellectual, and methodical. There was a disciplined mind behind the brutality, an organized rage that the Juarez police rarely encountered. Morales felt a reluctant admiration for the Vigilantes' efficiency, who was cleaning up the city in a way he never could. Morales unofficially reopened the Herrera case file. He reread the testimonies, the scarce evidence collected, and the profile of the husband, Julián Herrera, the history teacher. A pang of intuition, the kind that had kept him alive for 30 years on the force, made him pause. A teacher, a man who dealt with history, philosophy, and science. A man who lost everything to that gang and was betrayed by the system Morales represented. The connection was tenuous, almost absurd, but it refused to leave his mind. He decided to pay an informal visit to the school where Julián taught, under the pretext of a safety lecture for the youth. He needed to look the teacher in the eye, to feel the truth for himself, even if he didn't know what he would do with it. The cat-and-mouse game was about to begin, but Morales wasn't sure if he even wanted to catch the mouse. On the other hand, Elena, now a young and ambitious journalist for a small local newspaper, saw in the Avengers' crimes the story that could launch her career. But her motivation went beyond professionalism. She remembered the lessons of her former teacher, Julián Herrera, about the citizen's duty to fight for a better society through truth and the law. The vigilante's existence was, for her, a tragic symptom of the failure of those ideals. She believed that exposing the truth, both about the gang's crimes and the vigilante's actions, was the only way to heal the city. She didn't see a hero, but a broken man, and she feared his violence would only perpetuate the cycle of revenge that already consumed Juarez. Elena began to investigate on her own, using her intelligence and courage to navigate the dangerous neighborhoods. Her investigations led her to the same places as Julián, but following a trail of words instead of blood. She interviewed residents of the neighborhoods terrorized by the gang, people who were afraid to talk to the police, but who trusted the young woman with a sincere face, who promised them anonymity. They spoke of the Avenger with a mixture of fear and reverence. Elena began to build a psychological profile of the vigilante, connecting the targets and the chalk messages. She noticed the erudition behind the acts, the mind of an educator. The idea that it could be her former teacher was unthinkable, a dark fantasy. However, she remembered the deep sadness that had settled in him after his family's tragedy, and a seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. Their paths were on a collision course. Julián, oblivious to the investigation of his pursuers, focused on the next target, a lieutenant of El Carnicero known as El Perro. This was a more dangerous, more protected adversary. The hunt required weeks of surveillance and planning. Julián discovered that El Perro frequented an underground fight club in an industrial area of the city. The plan was risky, requiring him to infiltrate a hostile and unpredictable environment. During his surveillance one cold desert night, he was nearly discovered by a patrol of corrupt police who provided security for the place. He hid behind rusty containers, his heart pounding in his chest as the officers passed just feet away. The brush with failure shook him, reminding him that a single mistake would mean the end of his mission, and likely his life. The confrontation with El Perro was on a different level of brutality. The man was an experienced fighter, and the struggle was long and bloody, testing Julián's physical and mental limits. He emerged victorious, but severely injured, with a deep gash on his arm and several ribs he suspected were broken. As he dragged himself away from the scene, leaving behind the body and a quote from Plato on justice on the wall, the physical pain was nothing compared to the exhaustion of his soul. He took refuge in an abandoned building to tend to his wounds, shaking from cold and pain. In that moment of vulnerability, the image of Sophia and Luna came to his mind, not as a driver for revenge, but as a painful memory of the loving, gentle man he used to be. He looked at his hands, covered in his own blood and the blood of another man. The same hands that once held his daughter's little hand, that caressed his wife's face, were now instruments of death. A wave of self-loathing washed over him. Who was he now? A vigilante? An avenger? Or just another murderer in a city full of them? The line he had drawn in the sand between good and evil had been completely erased by the tide of blood he himself had created. The teacher, who taught about the complexity of the human condition, was now a tragic example of it. He had become the Nietzschean monster he so feared, and the realization broke him. There, alone in the darkness, Julián Herrera wept for the first time. Since his family was taken from him, The journey I began, driven by pain, has taken me to places inside myself I didn't know existed, dark, violent places. I wonder every night if there's anything left of the man I was, of the teacher who wanted to build a better world. Sometimes the weight of that question is unbearable. Telling this story, in a way, is an attempt to find meaning amidst the chaos I've become. I thank every one of you who subscribes and follows, because in a way, you become witnesses to my struggle, not just against the monsters out there, but against the monster growing in here. Your support reminds me that somewhere the humanity I fight for is still worth it. This internal crisis marked a turning point. Julián realized that simply eliminating gang members was not enough. It wouldn't bring his family back, nor would it heal the wound in his soul. His mission changed. It was no longer just about personal revenge, but about an attack on the very symbol of the impunity that plagued his city, El Carnicero. Killing him would not just be the end of his list, but a symbolic act, a final, terrible lesson. He needed to confront the source of his pain, the epicenter of the evil that transformed him. The hunt became more focused, more dangerous, and in his mind, the only possible form of redemption. He had to finish what he started, no matter the final cost to his already fragmented soul. As Julián recovered and planned his final move, Detective Morales paid his visit to the school. The conversation was tense and filled with subtext. Morales spoke about the violence in the city, about the Avenger, observing every micro-expression on Julián's face. Julián, in turn, spoke about the failure of the system, about the philosophy of justice, his words heavy with the weight of his experience. Neither man admitted anything, but a silent understanding passed between them. Morales saw the pain and contained fury in the teacher's eyes. Julián saw the resignation and veiled sympathy in the cop's eyes. As he left, Morales offered a subtle warning. "Be careful, Professor. Sometimes when we hunt evil in the abyss also hunts us." It was a warning and perhaps a nod of permission. Eleanor, for her part, made a crucial discovery. Analyzing the Avenger's messages, she noticed that the quotes and formulas were not random. They corresponded in order to the topics of the history and science curriculum that her former teacher, Julián Herrera, used to teach. The connection was undeniable and terrifying. The dark hero she was investigating was the same man who had inspired her to believe in justice. She went to his house, hoping to confront him, hoping he would deny it, and that her theory was wrong. She found the door unlocked. She went inside, calling his name, and found his office. On the wall, a map of the city, with locations marked in red, and on the desk, the open notebook with the list of names. The last name, circled several times, was El Carnicero. The truth hit her with the force of a punch. Julián returned home, still limping from his injuries, to find Elena in his office, holding the notebook. The confrontation was inevitable. Her eyes were filled with tears and a mixture of fear and disappointment. "Why, Professor?" she whispered, her voice choked. He didn't try to deny it. Instead, for the first time, he let his guard down and told her everything. The pain, the helplessness, the rage. He spoke not as a monster, but as a broken man, driven to extreme acts by a system that had abandoned him. He explained that his war was not just about revenge, but about sending a message that the innocent would not be forgotten. Elena listened, her heart torn between condemning his methods and a deep empathy for his pain. The dialogue between them was a clash of ideologies. Elena argued that his violence only fed the cycle of hatred, that true change would come from exposing the truth, from the strength of the law. Julián countered that their law was a sham, a tool for the powerful. "You fight with words and hope, Elena. I fight with the reality they created," he said, his voice laden with infinite sadness. He asked her to leave, to forget him, to not get involved in his darkness. He knew his path would end in tragedy, and he didn't want to drag her down with him. Eleanor left, shaken and confused, unsure whether she should expose him, help him, or simply walk away. Her faith in the world and in her former mentor was irreparably broken. The interaction with Elena solidified Julián's resolve. He realized there could be no turning back. He had crossed a threshold, and the only way to honor the memory of his family and perhaps find some kind of peace was to finish his mission. He began to prepare for the final confrontation with El Carnicero. It would not be a simple ambush. It had to be in a symbolic place, a place that would bring the conflict back to its beginning. His old house, the place where his happiness was built and then destroyed, would be the stage, or perhaps the school, the temple of knowledge that he had profaned with his nightly actions. The choice of location was crucial, as the battle would not only be physical, but a fight for the soul of what was left of Julián Herrera. He liquidated his assets, leaving an anonymous sum in an account for Elena, perhaps as an apology or a final act of a teacher looking after his student. He studied El Carnicero with a feverish obsession. The man was the personification of brutality, a product of the same sick society that created Julián. The antagonist was not just a criminal, he was the dark reflection of what the system's failure could breed. Sadistic, paranoid, and intelligent, El Carnicero had also realized he was being hunted. He wasn't hiding, he was preparing for war, fortifying his hideout and increasing his personal guard. He saw the Avenger not as a threat, but as a challenge to his power, and he yearned for the confrontation. Meanwhile, Morales felt the pressure mounting. His superiors wanted the Chalk Avenger captured, made a scapegoat for the police's ineffectiveness. But Morales knew that arresting Julián would be an even greater injustice. He decided to act in his own way. Using his informants, he began to leak information that disrupted El Carnicero's operations, creating chaos and weakening his organization. He wasn't helping Julián directly, but he was leveling the playing field. It was his way of giving the teacher a fighting chance, a way of balancing the scales of justice that he, as a police officer, could not move. He was betting on a broken man to do the job the law could not. The tension in the city was palpable. The populace felt that something big was about to happen. The showdown between the Avenger and El Carnicero was the talk of the town, a mythological battle unfolding on the streets of their city. Julián, for his part, finalized his preparations. He acquired a gun, not by preference but by necessity. He knew that against El Carnicero and his men, intelligence and surprise would not be enough. He practiced, the weapon feeling foreign and profane in his educator's hands. Each shot in the silence of the desert was an echo of his transformation, a reminder of how far he had strayed from the man he once dreamed of being. On his final night of preparation, Julián visited the cemetery. He stood before the gravestones of Sophia and Luna, the cold desert wind whistling around him. He did not pray or ask for forgiveness. He just talked to them in a hoarse whisper, telling them about his journey, about the monsters he had hunted and the monster he had become. He promised that he would finish it, that the man responsible for taking their lives would face justice, even if it was his own twisted version of it. It was a silent farewell, an acknowledgement that he might not return from this battle. He left a single white rose on each grave and walked away back into the darkness, ready for his final lesson. The stage was set. Julián sent a message to El Carnicero, not with words but with an act. He attacked one of the gang leader's front businesses, leaving behind not a quote, but an address, the school where he taught. It was an invitation, a direct challenge. He was bringing the war to his sanctuary, the place that represented everything he had lost. It would be there, among the maps, the books, and the ghosts of his classes, that the final confrontation would take place. The battle would not only be for revenge, but for the soul of a city and the redemption of a man who got lost in the pursuit of justice. The night of reckoning had arrived. The school at night was a skeleton of silent hallways and dark rooms, a place of memories haunted by the echo of laughter and bells that no longer rang. For Julián, it was familiar battlefield. Every corner, Every locker, every emergency exit was part of his territory. He moved through the shadows, not as an intruder, but as the custodian of a mausoleum. The atmosphere was charged with an almost electric tension, the silence amplifying the sound of his own breath, the beating of his heart. He was not waiting for El Carnicero in a fortress of guns, but in his own sanctuary of knowledge, the place that represented the antithesis of everything the criminal was. The final battle would not be one of strength alone, but of symbols. The teacher awaited, the monster in the heart of his temple, ready for the last and most terrible lesson of all, the one that would seal his fate forever. El Carnicero arrived with the arrogance of a conqueror, bringing with him 4 of his most loyal men. He saw Julián's invitation not as a threat, but as the audacity of an insect challenging a giant. The gang leader entered the school with a sadistic smile, anticipating the pleasure of destroying the man who dared to defy him on his own turf. However, the school's darkness quickly became a deadly labyrinth. Julián, using his tactical advantage, turned the environment into a weapon. One by one, the henchmen were neutralized through